Circumcision of boys is very common even outside of religious or old traditions, okay, as I mentioned. And it's prevalent in the world, even in some societies with very advanced medical care, like the USA, where the traditions of the families are not indicative of the practice. I'll just say that the United States is literally the only Western developed country that performs circumcision on a majority of boys for non-religious reasons. Israel also circumcises the majority of boys for explicitly religious reasons. So it's actually not the case that circumcision is common in other Western countries. There's a specific history as to why it became common in the United States. And well, actually, I'll be able to get into that by answering this question. So this says, I welcome discussion around circumcision of boys, even in a medical context. In society, however, circumcision of boys does not commonly denote discriminatory purposes, i.e. restricting boys' freedom is not a point of departure. So the main thing to do here is to distinguish between the original purpose or symbolic meaning on behalf of which a practice was introduced into a society, and the subsequent meanings and symbolic justifications that are offered as society's social and moral norms change. So with the case of male circumcision, it's agreed among scholars that the original purpose within Judaism, at least as Moses Maimonides, one of the great interpreters of Jewish law, said, was precisely that it was meant to dull the sexual organ. And the point was that the foreskin is erogenous tissue, it's nervous tissue that's very sensitive to the touch, and it therefore encourages children to want to play with this tissue. And the thought was that this is distracting to keeping their attention on higher and more spiritual matters. And so it was an explicitly anti-sexual practice within basically all of the history of Judaism. And if you talk to Orthodox or very conservative rabbis today, they'll still talk about the important role of male circumcision in dulling the sexual organ. Furthermore, in the United States, this is to go back to why was it introduced in the United States? It was introduced in the late 1800s for various complicated reasons, one main stream of which was to try to combat masturbation. So the very same issue, it's that little children are going to want to touch this part of their body. This tissue is the most sensitive tissue on the penis to light touch. And so by removing this tissue, and also by doing it without anesthesia so that it would be associated with pain, the original point in the United States, or one of the original points, was to have this anti-sexual motive. Now, it's true that it was not discriminatory at the time because they were also advocating anti-masturbation measures for girls, including applying carbolic acid to their clitorises. But that practice fell away. And so what remained actually was just the cutting of the boys. In other words, it is discriminatory in that only boys are subjected still to this practice that had its roots in anti-sexual motives. Now, every generation comes up with a new reason why it does what it does. If you look at female genital cutting, I'll have a chance, I think, to get into some of the deep African history as far as we can unravel it as to why female genital cutting was originally introduced. But what's happened is that societies that recognize that it's not seen as cool anymore to try to limit sexual impulses or to try to diminish the sexual desire, it's not effective in doing this, but insofar as that's the goal, and insofar as that's seen as reprehensible by Western powers that have a lot of influence over the laws and policies of African communities, well, they just come up with new reasons. They say, well, okay, we're not doing it for that reason anymore. We're doing it for health or for hygiene. And so again, according to the World Health Organization, in many communities, a third or more cases of female genital mutilation, cutting, circumcision are done by health professionals. And they'll talk about how there are bacteria that can gather under the hood of the clitoris or among the labia. And so by removing this tissue, you might have health benefits. And they say it's done for aesthetic reasons. And they say it's done because it's equal to what's done to the boys and so forth. So what happens is that as soon as you give a permissible reason for cutting the genitals of a child, then any community that's historically committed to performing this practice just needs to pronounce whatever reason you give them as the acceptable one. And there's no way to fact check them. You can't go inside their head and see whether they're doing it for quote unquote the right reasons. And again, in the United States with circumcision, we don't ask parents what their reasons are for doing it. We don't require that they do it for beneficent reasons. They could do it for malevolent reasons and it would still be permitted. So people, again, have to get their story straight about why they think these practices are wrong. I do not think that the impermissibility of cutting a child's genitals actually turns in any way on the reason the parent or the community has in mind for why it's done. And I'll just illustrate this. Imagine that you have a child who needs a root canal, an emergency root canal, because they have a problem with their teeth and their gums. And so they have to be taken to the dentist for a medically necessary root canal. Now, let's imagine that this child has an evil father who is sadistic and takes pleasure in his child's pain. And the reason why the father is taking the child to the dentist is purely to enjoy the squirming of his child for being subjected to this invasive procedure into his jaw. Well, the sadism of the father gives us very good reason to judge the moral character of the father. So, insofar as the society is promoting genital cutting because of motives that we don't like, because we think that they're doing it on behalf of reasons that we don't accept as tolerable from our cultural perspective, we may have reason to want to judge the motives of the parents. We may want to say, you need to get your cultural systems in order. But it actually has no bearing on the permissibility of the action itself. So in the case of the root canal, it's either permissible to do that or not. And it's not only permissible, it's ethically required to do it because it's medically necessary. The child needs to have this done to preserve their future bodily autonomy. And then the father can have either evil motives or beneficent motives, but either way, the root canal is permissible. So I think that we have to figure out when we're talking about the bad reasons for which we think something is done, and I'll just flag that a lot of this is based on pretty racist and colonial stereotypes about African communities being barbarians who want to control the sexuality of their daughters. That's largely not what's going on. As I mentioned before, male and female genital cutting are done in African societies largely as parallel rites of passage into adulthood, which serve many multifarious social functions. And insofar as there are anti-sexual motives, that's not a way of distinguishing male and female genital cutting, at least in terms of historical reasons that were offered by communities, which are now rapidly changing. Even in the United States, male circumcision was advocated as a way of combating masturbation into something like the 1960s or 70s, and then it wasn't until the sexual revolution when anti-sexual motives became unsupportable that you see this reason suddenly evaporating from the medical literature. But up until that point, that was the prevailing reason that some doctors were giving for why it should be done. Okay, so just to summarize that, if somebody has bad motives for cutting a child's genitals, we should judge their moral character negatively, and we should also judge perhaps the social systems that promote such negative thinking, and try to seek reforms that promote general equality in the society between men and women, let's say. But the reason for which something is done cannot by itself tell us whether the action itself is a rights violation. So I'll dwell on this for one more second. An action has to be a rights violation in the first place for you to then determine whether there's this aggravating factor of it's being done on behalf of objectionable motives. But something can't become a rights violation simply by being done on behalf of objectionable motives. So it's comparable to a hate crime. In order for a mindset of hate to affect how we judge the severity of the punishment that we'll give for a crime, there has to be a crime. And so in this case, the argument is, and this is an argument due to Kai Muller of the London School of Economics, he says, the expressive significance of an action may certainly make us judge negatively the motives of those who are performing the action, but bad motives can't make something a rights violation. It has to be a rights violation in the first place. And his argument is the rights violation is simply the non-consensual cutting, the presumed entitlement of the parents to apply a sharp object to their child's genitals when the child can't consent. But that's a gender-neutral rights violation. That's if you're cutting somebody's genitals without their consent, you can't define the rights violation in terms of what sexual anatomy does the person have. So again, there's a lot of confusion in this area based on these very, very broad stereotypes, some of which, as I suggest, are racist. But what they do is barbaric, and what we do is civilized. That's a very old story. But I think the moral argument is confused. Okay,